Hi guys, and welcome to the second part of Sources of Law. Now, today we will be looking at Acts of Parliament and how it fits into the grander scheme of things, and more so in this topic of sources of law. It's quite an important part to kind of wrap your head around.
Not interested, be quiet!
And I think it is a relatively easy subject, and it's a good starting point. Helps us to move on to other areas of law, such as case law or EU law. So today we will be looking at what we mean when we say Acts of Parliament. We're also going to need to be covering other things like statutory instruments, where they're placed in that hierarchy we looked at in the previous video, in terms of the supremacy of different sources of law, and why it's important to understand the concepts that are involved in the Acts of Parliament. Now, what is an Act of Parliament? You may have heard this strange word, statutes. Now, statute is essentially an act, a law. They're all synonymous words that are used. Just don't be thrown off when you see the word statutes, which is more commonly used, especially if you're studying the undergraduates, law schemes, or if you, for example, are reading a news article and you read a common statute that was passed. Now, they're all acts of parliament. They all kind of mean the same thing, and they are generally classed under laws. So the way that primary pieces of laws, such as statutes, are passed is that the members of Parliament, which are known as MPs, who sit in the House of Commons, will vote on a piece of legislation that's before the House. It goes through quite an intense process where the MPs will debate about it, it'll go back and forth. Some members might say this needs changing. Some members will not, will say, okay, we're not going to vote for it unless you change this part. And if it passes the House of Commons, it then gets moved up to the House of Lords. If they agree to it, all well and good, it's passed. If not, the House of Lords will come back to the House of Commons and say, well, you might need to make these amendments, and then they have to debate on it all again. You can see it's quite a lengthy process, and I'm sure you guys have enough knowledge, or you've seen the videos of what Parliament is like.
But if you stand again, I'll lord you out. Make your mind up. Either shut up and get out.
And it kind of leads us on to our second part, which are statutory instruments, which is quite a modern invention. So essentially, a statutory instrument is where a primary act of Parliament confers, which basically means gives power, to a delegated person or body to make secondary laws through a statutory instrument. So the statutory instrument is what's being used to allow that body to make all these new regulations and secondary pieces of law. So, for example, if you've heard of the Home Office, which mainly deals with immigration, or the Department for Work and Pension, which deals with benefits, what they do, they will pass regulations, secondary pieces of law that deal with these very specific areas of law. So the Home Office, well, when they pass a law, it doesn't affect things like benefits. It doesn't affect every single person, every single country, but at least whichever minister which is in charge of the Home Office can pass a law without it needing to go all the way back through Parliament. And what this does, it essentially helps save a lot of time. Because if you can imagine every single regulation that's passed, and there are a lot of regulations and laws that are passed by different bodies like the local authority, for example, the council, or the DVLA, if anybody's been unfortunate enough to deal with them, it means that the MPs don't have to go through all the bother while they want to be out, maybe partying, doing other things, even though they shouldn't be.
Don't gesticulate. Don't rant. Spare us the theatrics. Behave yourself. Be a good boy, young man. Be a good boy.
But it basically allows government bodies to make these laws without it going through Parliament again. Now, what's quite important is this idea of sovereignty. Parliament is considered to be a sovereign power. And the way that I'm going to kind of explain it is using the idea of a company. So we have this company, law reviewed, mega, super big international law firm. We have me at the very top. I'm in charge of all these big cases, I have all these people who work under me. Now, am I going to have time to be making meetings with all these people and all these people underneath? I'm going to be this hotshot lawyer doing all these big cases, being on TV all the time, doing interviews all the time. The reality is, no, I'm going to trust this manager. I'm going to say, okay, you're in charge of these people over here. If you want to let these people make rules for the people below them, go ahead. I'm going to write this up. I'm going to say, manager for marketing is in charge of marketing rules, and manager for production is in charge of production rules, and they can decide all the things that happen within their department. It saves me time, and it's more efficient because these people who work in these areas will have a better understanding of the law in that area and what maybe needs to change than me. However, unlike me, and when I make a rule as a final say, these rules that these people make are subject to scrutiny. Parliament has this idea of being a sovereign entity. It's supreme. It can undo and redo any law, and whatever it says or does cannot be subject to any scrutiny by any court. However, this sovereignty idea doesn't get passed on to the delegated parties. It doesn't get passed on to the delegated conferred bodies like the Home Office or the DWP. It leads us into the idea for judicial intervention, which is quite commonly referred to a judicial review. Now, the judicial review always happens in the High Court, and you can see here statutory instruments and statutory regulation are subject to judicial intervention, and it's because they don't have that sovereignty that they'll be subject to scrutiny by courts to make sure that when they pass a regulation or when they pass a law, they're not acting outside that statutory instrument which gave them that rule. And when you act outside your powers, for example, if the Home Office have said that each immigrant that comes to the country has to carry an ID that has all their information, all the money in their bank account needs to be listed on this document, the court is going to look to the act and say, actually, the Home Office are acting outside their powers by making people do this. The Act of Parliament never said that they're allowed to do this, and then that law can be struck down. And essentially, that is how judicial intervention, how the court then rebalances the power that has been given to these authorized bodies, these delegated bodies like the Home Office or other government bodies, by making sure they don't go further than what they really needed to do. And this kind of gives an element of control and protection for the general public against a government that is kind of seen as overreaching. Now, this is kind of just a brief summary of what we already said, that statutes and acts of Parliament are superior to case law, but only the primary acts are sovereign, not the secondary ones. And what is good is that when you need to apply, for example, the idea of which law to look at, do I look at case law, do I look at regulation, always start at the top when you're looking at a certain area of law, and then see, is there a secondary piece of law, and then see, is there case law in whatever question you're trying to answer. And that kind of helps you navigate and use the sources of law for what you need to do. I know it was slightly more detailed than the video before, which is more brief, and it's the first video that's a bit more thorough. But hopefully the next one will be a bit easier and a bit more interesting. Sources of law isn't a very fun subject for anybody, but it's really important to get these fundamentals done. Hopefully we'll see you soon in a video in the near future.